Hi everyone, this is lecture 6 and today we're covering reflexes. Now you're going to have a laboratory specifically dedicated to reflexes later in the semester. So I'm not going to overburden you so you hear the same material twice. So I'm going to cover the introduction, and this will probably give a good setup or introduction to when you cover it in the lab. So this particular lecture is not very long. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to define what a reflex is, and we'll talk about the different parts and functions of a reflex arc. We'll distinguish between a spinal and cranial reflex. Okay? And we'll distinguish between a somatic and a visceral or autonomic reflex. And we'll give you some basic examples of a stretch reflex, a flexor or withdrawal reflex, and something a little more complicated called a cross-extensor reflex. And we'll also define some basic terms that you will need to know for both the lab and the lecture, such as contralateral, ipsilateral, and reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so let's get started. Now, what's a reflex? This is about the shortest you can define a reflex in the fewest amount of words. Reflexes are protective, programmed, automatic responses to stimuli. Okay, so what does this mean? Let's break this down. Reflexes are protective. Okay, they're there for a reason. They're helped to protect your body. Of course, some reflexes we use as diagnostic tools clinically. Okay, like the knee-jerk reflex. It's not like the knee-jerk reflex is gonna help save your life sometime, but showing that it's functional suggests that your spinal cord and the nerves innervating the knee-jerk reflex are working properly. So they're protective. Another important word is they're programmed. Okay, meaning that we don't have to learn them. Okay, it's not like you go to the doctor's office and practice your knee-jerk reflex. You don't need to do that. Okay, of course, some reflexes are developmentally produced from the infant to as you're older, then they become more distinguishable. But as an adult, they're programmed. Reflexes are also automatic, meaning that you don't have to think about it. It just happens on their own. So they're protective, programmed, automatic responses to stimuli. Okay, now this is an important word because reflexes will not be very functional. They just happen on their own. You're sitting there minding your own business, your knee jerks. Well, that's not very good. Okay, so these reflexes require a stimuli. Okay, so reflexes are protective, programmed, automatic responses to stimuli. Okay, so all these words are important in their definition. We have what's called a reflex arc. A reflex arc is like a blueprint or a map, and that illustrates the sequence of steps in reflex. Okay, and a reflex arc begins with a sensory stimulus. So it starts with a stimulus and it ends with a rapid motor response. Now, rapid, that's kind of variable. How fast is fast? Okay, so some reflexes are kind of variable. It could be immediately or may take a few minutes. So here's a picture of a reflex arc. Okay, why? Because it says right here, reflex arc. Okay, in all different colors. Well, not all different colors of the rainbow. Blue, orange, and pink. Okay. Well, anyways, it begins what the peripheral nervous system detects and delivers stimulus to the central nervous system. So we have the sensory afferent division. Okay, you don't want to forget these terms. Okay, so the sensory afferent division is the first step, where the peripheral nervous system detects and delivers the stimulus to the central nervous system. Okay, and we said it ends with a motor response. So it's going to end with a motor efferent division, where the peripheral nervous system delivers motor responses from the central nervous system to the effectors. So we have a sensory afferent, motor efferent division. This is how it begins, and this is how it ends. Okay, well, what happens in the middle? Well, in the middle is what's called neural integration. Okay, this is where your central nervous system decides and thinks about what it should do in response to the stimulus. So neural integration occurs in the central nervous system between the sensory stimulus and the motor response. So now let's go back to our figure here. Oh, here's the CNS integration stimulus right here in the middle here. And that's composed in the central nervous system. Okay? So we have peripheral nervous system, central nervous system, to peripheral nervous system. Okay? We have the sensory afferent division. We have neural integration, and then we have the motor efferent division. Okay, and this constitutes a simple reflex arc. Okay, of course, some reflexes are much more complicated than this. Okay, and some are very simple, in which these two are just synapsed together. Now let's look at different types of reflexes. Okay, reflexes are classified by the number of synapses and the types of organs they innervate. Okay. How about, let's take number of synapses first. Okay. Fortunately, we only have two classes. We have monosynaptic reflexes that contain one synapse, okay, or two neurons, okay, or polysynaptic reflexes, which have multiple synapses, okay. So it's kind of convenient. We have two choices, one or more than one, okay. Now, the other criteria of classifying reflexes are the types of organs that they occur in. We have visceral reflexes and we have somatic reflexes. Okay, visceral reflexes innervate internal organs and are associated with the autonomic nervous system. Okay, the autonomic nervous system, you learned briefly a little bit about in SCB 203 when we were talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, later on we're going to have a full lecture on the autonomic nervous system. Okay, but for now we'll say visceral organs are associated with the autonomic nervous systems and they innervate internal organs. There's also somatic reflexes, which are involved in, of course, somatic sensory and motor neurons of the cranial or spinal nerves. Okay, so we have visceral reflexes and somatic reflexes. Let's take a look at an example of a simple stretch reflex. This is probably one of the simplest ones you could probably identify, and it's an example of a monosynaptic reflex, meaning there's one synapse, but we're going to have at minimum two neurons. Okay? So what occurs during a simple stretch reflex? Well, a muscle is stretched and it changes its optimal length. Okay, so if you remember, you might have seen this figure in SCB 203 when we were talking about the sarcomere. And when you stretch a muscle, it changes its optimal length. Okay, and of course you can't stretch it too much; it'll go down. If you squish it in too much, that's going down too. But it has to be just right. Okay, well anyway, the body's reflexive response is to shorten the muscle to return back to its optimal length. So if you stretch a muscle too far, the body's going to try to bring it back to its optimal length. Okay, and essentially that's what occurs in a simple stretch reflex. So for example, here in a simple example is this person holding a cup. Okay, and of course the cup is fairly light. It's not going to have too much stress on the arm. However, when someone starts pouring a liquid, the water has a very high density, it's going to add mass to the cup, especially also the effect of gravity. And this is going to put force on the arm, okay? And it's going to cause the muscle to stretch. And as a result of this simple stretch reflex, the muscle spindles detect the stretch, and these efferents are going to send information to the spinal cord so that the muscle will then shorten back to its optimal length, and you don't drop your cup and your drink. Okay. So there is a kind of a functional use for the stretch reflex. Okay? And if you continue on, we see that the second afferents, it goes through the dorsal root, and here's the dorsal root ganglion with the cell body, and it forms a synapse here in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay, so it's monosynaptic. So here's the one synapse, and now it synapses with a motor neuron. This one is called an alpha motor neuron, and it synapses out the ventral root. And as it extends out, it innervates the muscle, so the muscle contracts. And you hang on to your cup when you're drinking it. I assume it's a drink. I guess it's a drink. Okay? And now the muscle stays at optimal length, and your drink is stable. So that's an example of a simple stretch reflex. It's monosynaptic, meaning that there's one synapse. So that means there's two neurons. Okay. There's a sensory afferent and a motor efferent. Notice what a synapse is. It's in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So this is where, even though it's monosynaptic, this is pretty much where the neural integration is occurring. Okay? So we start with a simple one, but we'll go to more complicated ones. Now, a simple stretch reflex is actually a little more complicated than we just showed, because even in monosynaptic reflexes, sensory neurons also synapse with interneurons in the spinal cord. Okay, we haven't talked too much about interneurons. Now, the reason why is that they function to inhibit the antagonistic muscle, which is called reciprocal inhibition. So what happens is, if you're going to contract one muscle, in order to make it more efficient, the antagonistic muscle is going to be inhibited, so that the contracting muscle doesn't have any nothing fighting against it. Okay? So if you want to define reciprocal inhibition, it's a relaxation of muscle on one side of the joint to accommodate the contraction of a muscle on the other side. So let's take a look at an example here. This figure is not in your text, but it shows an example of reciprocal inhibition. And I tried to pick one that was kind of similar to the one that we just looked at. Okay? So let's see. So here's the muscle spindle. Okay? And it's going to the dorsal root here, and it's synapsing into the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay, and this is our stretch reflex because it's monosynaptic, so that the muscle spindle now shortens, or the muscle shortens. Okay, here the muscle spindle is being activated, and then it's going to shorten the muscle. But if you notice that even in this monosynaptic reflex, we also have an inhibitory interneuron here that's branching off. And this synapses with another motor neuron, but it's going to inhibit the antagonistic muscle. So as the muscle spindle shortens here in the biceps, inhibiting the triceps will allow more efficient shortening of the biceps. And this is an example of reciprocal inhibition. We'll show another example of reciprocal inhibition a little bit later, but using the lower appendages. Okay? So here, again, we have a sensory neuron synapsing with a motor neuron to cause shortening of the muscle, but we also have a synapse to an interneuron, which will be inhibitory so that the antagonistic muscle is inhibited, so it doesn't contradict the biceps. Okay? Let's look at another example of a common reflex, and one is called the patellar, or knee-jerk reflex. So it's another example of a stretch reflex. Okay? And we've all been to the doctor's office where they have a little rubber hammer, and they tap the patellar tendon with this reflex hammer. This what happens is it stretches the quadriceps muscles to extend the knee. Okay. Again, remember all these reflexes are there for protective purposes, so that the muscles don't get too stretched. The knee will extend to shorten the muscle. So it takes off stress from the stretching. Okay. So here's the little rubber hammer, which is the stimulus. Okay. It's hitting the patellar tendon. This stretches the tendon and the muscle. We have the receptors, which are the muscle spindle. This sends a sensory afferent neuron through the dorsal root. Okay. And here it synapses with a motor neuron, cause the quadriceps to contract, and you move your leg by the knee jerk reflex, by kicking of the leg. Okay. But take a look again. We also have another synapse with an interneuron here in the spinal gray matter. And this synapses to an efferent neuron to the hamstrings. So this is also another example of the inhibition of the antagonist muscle. Okay. So the hamstrings aren't going to interfere with the contraction of the quadriceps. Okay, and that's a knee-jerk reflex. Of course, there's also going to be branches going to the brain because you have the sensation or your realization that your knee is kicking. Another reflex is called the Golgi tendon reflex. Okay, this is a polysynaptic reflex that protects muscles and tendons from damage. Again, all these reflexes are part of our physiology because they're used to protect the tissues of our body. But we often use these as clinical tests to see if something's wrong. Okay, so if you go through a knee-jerk reflex and your knee doesn't kick, well, there might be something wrong. Okay. Now, the Golgi tendon reflex is kind of interesting because it's opposite. It causes muscle relaxation. Okay. Increased tension causes the Golgi tendon organs to inhibit contracting muscles, a simultaneously activation of the antagonistic muscle. Okay. So, for example, I guess one is the weightlifter who tries to lift too much. You need a spotter, so that way, if it's too heavy, his muscles will just relax, and rather than have the weight fall on him, the spotter has to be able to catch it. Okay. Now here's an example of a cross extension reflex, and this is going to be a little more complicated now, which occurs simultaneously with the flexion reflex, because it involves both legs. Okay, so let's describe the scenario first. This guy is stepping on some glass, I guess, or stepping on something. Okay, and so your immediate response is to lift the leg up. Okay, but of course, in order to lift your leg up, the other leg is going to have to stabilize so that you don't fall over. Okay, and it took me a long time to understand this figure, because I was thinking of bending your leg, but this figure is showing flexing of the hip, and then once I figured that out, then it made more sense. Okay, so he steps on this object here, and when stimulated, nociceptors are pain receptors, afferent transmit the painful stimulus to the spinal cord. Okay, so here's the sensory afferent neuron. Here's the dorsal root ganglion. Here it synapses in the gray matter of the spinal cord. It synapses with several interneurons, 1, 2, where integration occurs. And the alpha motor neurons stimulate the hip flexors of the limb, receiving the painful stimuli to contract, and he lifts his leg up. Okay. But of course, simultaneously, in order so he doesn't fall over, we see a synapse here to another interneuron that synapses and crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord, and synapses with a motor neuron, which causes the opposite leg to contract. Okay. Now we have several terms here. When we have the reflex on the same side of the body, we say that's what's considered an ipsilateral response. When it crosses over to the other side, that's a contralateral response. Okay. Now, to make things even more complicated, we could also have reciprocal inhibition of the antagonistic muscles. Okay. In this next figure, well, I'm going to show you another flexion of the leg, which made more sense to me, but until I understood what that previous figure was describing. Okay. And it's the same thing here. This person's stepping on something, he lifts his foot up, and he stands on the other leg. So there's nothing different between this figure and the other figure. The only thing that's different is he's bending his leg rather than flexing the hip. Okay. And the other unique difference between this figure and the previous figure is now it's showing reciprocal inhibition. So it's a little more complicated, but it's actually more realistic. So here's he's stepping on something. Here's a sensory neuron going to the dorsal root. Here's the dorsal root ganglion with the cell body. It's synapses in the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay, it's synapses with an interneuron. And here it innervates the flexors to flex the flexors contract. Okay, lifts the leg up. Okay, but notice that there's another set of interneurons synapsing with another set of motor neurons to the extensor muscles, which are going to antagonize them and keep them relaxed so that you can lift your leg up freely. Okay. Now at the same time, we have that's the ipsilateral response. Now the interneuron crosses over to the other side of the spinal cord, and after synapsing with the interneuron, a motor neuron will cause the extensors to contract. Okay, so you stand on your leg. And then we have the inhibitory synapse here to another motor neuron so that the flexors relaxes. So we have reciprocal inhibition on both the ipsilateral side and the contralateral side. Okay, and we have many more synapses here. So this is truly a polysynaptic reflex. Okay, so make sure you understand this. More than likely, your lab instructor is going to talk about this as well. Okay, so at least you have a pretty good idea of what's it about, and he might show a different type of figure. Okay, notice that the red is inhibitory and the green is stimulatory to help you. Okay, more than likely in the lab you're going to have to find some way. We used to have most lab instructors make you draw this, but it might be kind of hard on an online test to draw this. Or maybe he might have you label it, for example. I don't know. So we have reflex terminology. Oops, I have a spelling error here. Reflex terminology. We have contralateral refers to the opposite side of the body. Ipsilateral refers to the same side of the body. And I'll fix this reciprocal inhibition, the spelling, and we know that already. This is where the relaxation of the antagonistic muscle on the other side of the joint. Okay. So, so this is just another figure here. Here, the quadriceps strongly contracts from the Golgi tendon organ, are activated. Afferent fibers synapse with the interneurons to the spinal cord. Okay, and the efferent impulses to the muscle stretch, tendons are dampened, muscle relaxes, reducing tension. Okay, so this is just showing the effect of the Golgi tendon organ. I guess this would have been better in the previous when I talked about Golgi tendon organ, so I might have to fix this as well. Okay, and then efferent impulses to the antagonist muscle are used to contract. Okay, so here's the Golgi tendon where the result is relaxation of the muscle. Okay. Now finally we have cranial nerve reflexes. Okay, cranial nerve reflexes involves two nerves. Okay, afferent and efferent. And you'll probably talk more about these in the lab, so I'm just going to introduce them to you as two examples, the gag reflex and the corneal blink reflex. Okay, the gag reflex stimulation is stimulation of the glossopharyngeal nerve in the throat. Okay, and the stimulus is brought to the medullary nucleus, where it's stimulated by something sticking in your throat. You stick your finger down your throat, that will stimulate the gag reflex. And it's shared by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to elicit the gagging sound and action. So this is something you could try on yourself if you want. Okay. Corneal blink reflex. If someone pokes you in the eye, there's a pretty good chance you're going to blink. Okay. And so the blink reflex causes you to blink when an object contacts the eye. And the reflex is triggered when the cornea is stimulated by the trigeminal nerve and integrates by the pons to contract the orbicularis muscle. Okay, so the gag reflex and the corneal blink reflexes are two easy ones to practice yourself on if you want, and because they usually always will give a positive result. Okay. Okay. So I'll go back and fix those two, that one spelling error and the figure. Okay, but I think this is enough preview so that you'll be fine and you look really smart in the lab. Okay, so this is the end of lecture 6.